Remove the locking clip attached to the rinsing bowls and remove from the integrated loading bath. Next, remove the locking clips connecting the distal and proximal trays. Lift the tray connector from the distal tray and swivel the distal tray 180 degrees counterclockwise, so both the loading bath and handle are on your right side. Clip the tray tab on the distal tray to the tray tab holder on the proximal tray and fill the integrated loading bath with cold sterile saline, 0 degrees Celsius to 8 degrees Celsius, 32 degrees Fahrenheit to 46 degrees Fahrenheit. Remove the bioprosthesis from its container by carefully grasping one of the frame paddles with a pair of blunt-tipped forceps. Caution: do not use the forceps to grasp the tissue portion of the valve. Next, carefully remove the serial number tag and suture from the bioprosthesis, and confirm it matches the serial number on the container. Do not use the bioprosthesis if the serial numbers do not match. Immerse the entire bioprosthesis in a sterile rinsing bowl containing 500 milliliters of fresh saline at ambient temperature, 15 degrees Celsius to 25 degrees Celsius, 59 degrees Fahrenheit to 77 degrees Fahrenheit, and gently agitate by hand for 15 seconds to remove the glutaraldehyde from the bioprosthesis. Next, transfer the bioprosthesis to the second rinsing bowl. Fill with 500 milliliters of fresh saline at ambient temperature and gently agitate by hand for an additional 15 seconds. Finally, transfer the bioprosthesis to the third bowl and leave submerged in the ambient sterile saline until it is ready to be loaded. Attach a 10 milliliter syringe filled with sterile saline to the capsule flush port on the proximal end of the handle. Carefully lift the distal end of the catheter to a near vertical orientation and open the capsule to expose the paddle attachment. Note: retract the capsule until the blue handrest on the handle is even with the blue tip retrieval mechanism to ensure the paddle attachment is fully exposed for loading. While the capsule is held vertically, begin flushing the capsule flush port. As saline exits the open capsule, continue flushing and gently lower the capsule into the loading bath until it is completely submerged. Secure a locking clip in the clip holder to maintain the catheter tip submerged in the integrated loading bath. Submerge and cool the rinsed bioprosthesis in the integrated loading bath filled with cold sterile saline. Note: perform the following steps while the distal end of the catheter and bioprosthesis are immersed in the integrated loading bath filled with cold sterile saline to minimize the introduction of air into the loaded system. Ensure that the capsule guide tube is fully open, with the locking collar at the proximal end of the capsule guide tube. Advance the capsule guide tube over the catheter shaft toward the handle and across the catheter tip. Once the catheter tip has been crossed, fully advance the locking collar to the distal end of the capsule guide tube until it is closed. Continue to advance the capsule guide tube over the catheter shaft towards the handle until it contacts the distal end of the capsule. Caution: do not attempt to advance the capsule guide tube over the capsule. This will prevent proper loading of the bioprosthesis. Next, ensure that the backplate has been inserted into the inflow cone and the exposed part of the backplate is facing up before inserting the inflow portion of the bioprosthesis frame into the inflow cone with the C-paddle facing up and aligned with the paddle attachment pockets. Secure the outflow cone onto the inflow cone until it locks, and then insert the catheter tip guide tube completely into the distal end of the inflow cone. Insert the distal catheter tip into the catheter tip guide tube and retract the catheter tip guide tube to set the bioprosthesis frame paddles into the paddle attachment pockets. Note: allow the loading tools to rest on the loading bath floor to ensure coaxial alignment with the delivery system to assist in seating of the paddles within the paddle attachment. Use the mirror in the loading bath to confirm the paddles are properly seated and the crowns are aligned and not overlapping or crossed before advancing to the next step. If the paddles are not seated properly or the crowns are crossed, it is acceptable to manually compress the frame with fingertips to position correctly. Once the paddles are properly seated and the crowns aligned, hold the loading tool stationary with the right hand while maintaining coaxial alignment, and manually advance the capsule guide tube towards the valve so that the distal section covers the paddles and top portion of the outflow crowns. Use the mirror to ensure both frame paddles are still seated correctly and all crowns are aligned and contained within the distal tip of the capsule guide tube before advancing to the next step. Next, apply slight proximal pressure on the loading tool while maintaining coaxial alignment, and turn the deployment knob to advance the capsule until it covers the proximal half of the paddles. At this point, stop advancing the capsule and use the mirror to confirm that both paddles are properly seated within the paddle pockets. Caution: do not advance the capsule over the bioprosthesis frame paddles unless they are fully seated in the center of the paddle attachment pockets. Advancing the capsule before the paddles are fully seated could damage the capsule. Continue to advance the capsule and capsule guide tube until it covers all outflow crowns. Use the mirror to confirm that all outflow crowns are aligned and contained within the capsule before continuing to the next step. Continue to advance the capsule until the distal end of the capsule guide tube covers the distal end of the commissure pad of the bioprosthesis. The deployment knob should turn easily within the loading tray. Excessive force required to turn the knob and/or clicking sound may indicate that the valve is not being loaded properly. Once the capsule completely covers the commissure pads, remove the backplate and catheter tip guide tube and advance the inflow cone toward the capsule guide tube to crimp the inflow portion of the bioprosthesis. During this step, the outflow cone contacts the locking collar component and moves it to an unlocked configuration. Note: ensure the bioprosthesis frame axis is visually aligned with the inflow cone axis during the insertion of the bioprosthesis into the inflow cone, and complete the insertion of the bioprosthesis into the inflow cone in one uninterrupted movement. Advance the capsule over the bioprosthesis until the capsule comes within 5 mm of the catheter tip. Then, remove the loading tools from the catheter as one unit and close the remaining gap between the capsule and catheter tip under direct visualization. Note: if the capsule does not completely close, you will need to employ the overdrive feature by continuing to turn the deployment knob after it reaches the front gray rest. The overdrive feature will click as the knob is turned and the capsule continues to advance. Take care not to advance the capsule over the nose cone. If this occurs, simply turn the deployment knob in the opposite direction until the nose cone is no longer overcaptured. Finally, relieve stress on the system by turning the deployment knob in the direction of the arrows until the knob moves freely. Visually and tactilely inspect the capsule for a misloaded valve. The capsule should be straight, smooth, and free of any bends, protrusions, or discolorations. If any of these conditions are felt or observed, the valve is likely to be misloaded. Prior to inserting the system in the patient, implanters must perform an inspection of the loaded capsule under fluoroscopy to confirm proper loading. If a misload is detected, unsheath the valve and examine the frame for permanent deformation, frayed sutures, or valve damage. If no issues are found, the valve may be attempted to be loaded a second time. However, the loader must replace the delivery system and use a new loading bath with fresh saline. Remove the loaded stylet from the guide wire lumen at the capsule and attach a 10 ml syringe filled with sterile saline to the wire lumen flush port on the proximal end of the handle and flush. Attach a 10 ml syringe filled with sterile saline to the stability layer flush port on the distal end of the handle and flush. Attach a 10 milliliter syringe filled with sterile saline to the Inveo inline sheath flush port and flush. Leave the bioprosthesis submerged in sterile saline until implantation.